Welcome back. Time for tonight's debate. Tonight, fighting continues in Debaltseve, leaving the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine looking increasingly shaky. Rebels say they've taken most of the town and now hold 80% of it. The government says it still holds a number of key positions, although it has acknowledged this evening that a number of its soldiers have now been surrounded. Others today were kidnapped by separatists who've been accused by Kiev of destroying the ceasefire and with it any hope of peace. A presidential spokesman in Kiev today called on members of the EU and NATO to protest against the actions of the rebels. France's foreign minister has said that fundamental parts of that ceasefire were not being respected, both in Debaltseve and because of the withdrawal of heavy weaponry, which was planned for today, but which did not go ahead. So is that deal dead? The deal signed in Minsk last week, so-called Minsk II, which led to that ceasefire taking effect just after midnight on Saturday night. That's the question for my guests tonight. I joined here in the studio by Michel Grabar, who's an elected member of the Coordination Council of the Russian Forum here in France. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Also with me here in the newsroom is Anna Garmash, who was a Euromaidan activist and president of Ukraine Action Association. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm also joined this evening by Julian Lundy and other regular guests on this question, an independent journalist, and I believe you were part of one of the recent OEC missions to Ukraine.
I was there twice last year.
We're going to
for
be
a total of 4 months.
discussing with you on the ground perhaps some of the difficulties involved. Also here in the studio is Julien Théron, who's an analyst in geopolitics of conflicts and who teaches at the University of Versailles. Thank you for being with us. First, we're going to head, though, to Kiev to speak to Max Tucker, who's the editor of the Kiev Post and recently returned from Debaltseve. What are you hearing about what's happening in the town tonight?
So we have the correspondent in Debaltseve, and we've been in very close contact with a medic who's still in the town. He's been trapped in the town since the 5th of February. Enemy forces are now close into a distance about 500 meters away. The fighting is extremely heavy there. I mean, we saw rockets raining down all around the town. Last time we were in Debaltseve, people screaming and running for their basements. I could only imagine how bad it is now with the close quarters fighting in the city as well.
What does that mean from the point of view of the government in Kiev? Should Debaltseve fall to the separatists, as it looks increasingly unlikely that it might, what would, in your view, be Kiev's position regarding the deal that was signed in Minsk last week?
Well, I think Kiev is in a very difficult position now. I mean, even before the ceasefire took effect, the separatists were saying that they didn't consider the ceasefire to apply to Debaltseve, and that they would carry on fighting there. They would carry on trying to capture the town and squeeze the Ukrainian forces out of it. The loss of Debaltseve now would be a major blow for Ukraine. It doesn't look like the fighting is going to stop anytime soon. Ukraine has said it's not going to withdraw its heavy weaponry from the front lines. The rebels said that they won't do that unilaterally. It doesn't really look like either side was very intent on keeping the peace. But particularly the rebels who clearly feel that they're winning and they want to continue.
Julien Théron, we'll come back to you in just a moment, Max, if we may. Julien Théron, I'd like to ask you, it doesn't look as though the cycle of violence has come to an end, one of those cases where the truce may have been, the deal may have been brought about by external pressure, but fundamentally the forces on the ground do not agree, for a start, about where that crucial front line should pass, since Debaltseve would form a crucial part of any new line.
Well, yes, actually the heavy weaponry was supposed to be out from today, actually. So Kiev says that they will do start when the rebels stop firing at their troops. And the rebels do not stop, and I read today a senior rebel commander saying that it is a kind of moral obligation because Debaltseve is a part of their territory. But of course, if there's some firing, it's because it's not part of their territory. And when you do sign an agreement, well, you do have to apply it.
Perhaps we can look at a map of that front line that's at the heart of the Minsk II agreement. We saw it a little earlier on. Perhaps we can bring it back and have a look at where that crucial town of Debaltseve stands, and it makes some sense of how it would affect not just the front line, but the possible shape of a separatist zone. I wonder, Julian Nundy, whether looking at that map, and you can see there clearly that for the time being, and according to the Minsk agreement, Debaltseve sits on the other side of the line. If it falls to the separatists, that front line changes shape. Does that not mean that the deal is dead in the water?
It has to be remembered that Debaltseve is a very, very, very strategic town. It's a rail junction, and it's also a junction of two major roads. So for communications, it's an extremely important place for either side to hold on to or to capture. You asked the question about whether this means the end of the ceasefire. I would hate to be the person responsible for saying yes, but it certainly makes the ceasefire increasingly untenable.
Michel Grimbard, the ceasefire being based on a line that appears no longer to stand tonight, is Minsk 2 dead?
No, Minsk 2 is not dead, and I'm very glad, because we were very close to a real war, and now in Minsk 2 the right positions were written down. So, but Debaltseve is a real problem, because it's a very strategic place, and from the point of view of the separatists, it's not concerned by the ceasefire. So I know in Minsk, President Putin was talking 16 hours were devoted to Debaltseve during the conference in Minsk. So it's a very difficult problem, but I think we must say that there is a process, and that a very good process, I think. That's one thing. And the other problem is to solve the situation in Debaltseve.
Anna Garmash, even as it looks as though the separatists seem to be winning the battle on the ground in Debaltseve, will it not be the case, if Minsk 2 is going to last, and given that it's the only game in town and the hope of the international community as well, will it not be the case that Kiev will simply be obliged to accept that it's lost the town?
I think there is a question of principle for a very large extent, because when the Minsk agreement was signed, Debaltseve was still held by Ukrainian forces, and technically there are still Ukrainian forces over there. They were still there at the moment of at the moment when the ceasefire was supposed to be applied, and they're still there technically. So the territory that is held by Russian and pro-Russian fighters, that was held at that moment, should be, so to speak, theirs, and the other and the rest should sort of belong to the Ukrainian army. I don't think that should still be fighting going on. Technically, the Minsk agreement is not working. I'm sorry.
Perhaps we can go back to Max, who's in Kiev. What are you hearing, Max, about conditions for the people in Debaltseve? Of course, international observers haven't managed to get to the town for the fighting that's been going on there. What are people on the ground telling you about conditions in the town? It's been going on for so many weeks now.
Yes, and when we were last in the town, the situation for them hasn't much changed. I mean, some people have managed to be evacuated from the town. I think there's still about 2,000 people stuck there. And they essentially live in their basements, melting snow for drinking water. They've got no water, no food, no electricity. It's an absolutely dire situation for them, and the buildings are coming down all around them. So those people that are stuck there, there's really very little hope for them escaping from the situation alive. And the same goes from the soldiers who are now, Ukrainian soldiers are now stuck in isolated pockets of resistance, fighting off the separatist forces without ammunition and without food. It's a very difficult situation for all concerned.
Are we not standing on the brink of a bloodbath then in Debaltseve for those Ukrainian soldiers left?
I think indeed we are, and I think the bloodbath has already started. We're seeing more and more pictures of dead Ukrainian soldiers who have tried to break out of the encirclement, bodies on the streets of civilians who have been hit by shells or caught in the crossfire. It's already starting. Both sides have always played down their casualties quite drastically. One of your guests said earlier that we're on the brink of a real war. I think we've been having a real war for quite some time. It's just that both sides play down their casualties.
It has, Julien Théron, one of the characteristics of all that's been going on in eastern Ukraine has been that both sides have wanted to play things down. The fact of the matter is that over the last few months, 5,600 people have been killed. This has been a war.
Yes, it's definitely a war. And NATO and yesterday or today, the EU actually signed a statement saying that there was Russian forces inside this area. So I think that what is very important is not the question of Debaltseve, well, except for the people living there, of course. But if we let down Debaltseve, tomorrow there will be another place where the rebels consider like their territory, like, for instance, in the south, near Mariupol, because there has been shellings over there since this weekend, where it's supposed to be a ceasefire. So they will probably try to get more territory again. And one of the main points, which was not treated by Minsk II, and which is very important, François Hollande and Angela Merkel really tried too, but is the control of the border between Ukraine and Russia. And Russia has definitely to put pressure on that and to let the OSCE members to control this border as it is supposed to be done with
I'd like
Minsk.
to come back to that question of the border between Ukraine and Russia in a little while. First of all, I'd like to ask you what you think. If Debaltseve is allowed to fall to the separatists, is there any limit to where the separatists will go? I mean, Kiev cannot allow it to happen simply because the line having been drawn on the other side of the town. Kiev, in order to be credible, in order to stand firm, has to say that it cannot allow it.
From my point of view, when the problem will be solved in Debaltseve, the situation will be much more peaceful. But your journalist said that 2,000 people were stuck in Debaltseve. There used to be 6,000 or 7,000 militaries or soldiers and officers. So it's like the airport in Donetsk. It was the place which the official Ukrainian army could not abandon, and before the beginning of the ceasefire. So now we have to solve this situation with as well as possible. But I think that they will not go to Mariupol, and the limit is clear now. And from my point of view, if the separatists will not go to Mariupol, and they will let people, OSCE, and control the border between
OSCE
Russia and Ukraine.
was not allowed to enter Debaltseve today.
Debaltseve is a special problem. So we have to separate Debaltseve and the rest of the situation, from my point of view.
Julian Lundy, the question of so much does seem to flow from the question of Debaltseve. It was because the fighting was going on today that the two sides said they wouldn't withdraw their heavy weaponry. Perhaps one can imagine a scenario where Debaltseve, having de facto fallen to the separatists, it is decided by all sides that the agreement can now go ahead. I mean, perhaps there is a glimmer of a hope still that even if the Ukrainian forces lose this town, Minsk could be saved.
Well, it would have to be renegotiated slightly. I mean, this can obviously be done on a telephone. It can be, don't have to get all these presidents back in Minsk to do it all again. But it would have to be there would have to be some new agreement, and it's very difficult to see how Kiev would agree to lose face so completely.
Anna, any glimmer of hope for it at all?
It's very difficult to think so, because you cannot, if you have agreed on something, on this agreement, on those different points of the agreement, on a specific line, you cannot start shifting lines right after that. It's a question of trust. If you want a ceasefire, both sides have to stop firing. Obviously, nobody is going to withdraw. The Ukrainian army, in particular, is not going to withdraw the heavy weapons if they still feel like they are under attack. So I do not feel like there's anything that can go forward unless there's maybe something that's renegotiated, because you really have to start with a clean agreement.
Julien Théron, much will depend, of course, on the force with which the actions of the separatists are condemned, which is what Kiev has asked the West, NATO and the EU to do. So far, they haven't come out and condemned terribly forcefully what's been going on. And throughout this, although Angela Merkel and François Hollande got very personally involved in this last week, precisely as a result of the encirclement of Debaltseve, it's difficult to imagine the sort of forceful language it would take from either NATO or the EU to put down what's been done in Debaltseve and to get the separatists to back off. It simply hasn't worked so far. The strength is not there on the other side.
Because it does not depend on the EU and NATO side, actually. It's on the Russia side to put pressure on the separatists and its own forces over there. So, but actually there will be an extraordinary meeting in Estonia from the EU, where the General Secretary from NATO will be invited in the coming days. So there will be maybe a point where where the talk will be harder, actually.
As for any pressure that Moscow could put on the separatists, there hasn't been much of it so far.
So I think that President Putin can put pressure on separatists, but to a certain point, but it's not so easy for him too, because otherwise he would not have talks so long in Minsk too on these special topics. So for him it's a real problem. The next step for me is of course to stop. The risk was that NATO could have been involved in the process, or the Americans. And I am very glad that Europeans, that President Holland and Mrs. Merkel, Angela Merkel, were helping solving the situation. Because the next step is to force President Poroshenko to talk to separatists, and he doesn't want to talk to them because for him they are rebels, and the real issue is to force the separatists and the official Ukrainians to talk to each other, and we didn't reach this point to this moment.
Is it time that Petro Poroshenko and speak to the rebels?
One must consider in the first place who are those so-called rebels. I'd rather call them Russian and pro-Russian fighters, because there have been numerous reports on the fact that Russian army is actually fighting there, and the EU, as it was mentioned before, yesterday I think, actually recognized in their official papers that the army was there, within the sanctions, by the way, where they actually sanctioned people who were directly responsible for this army involvement. According to different types of organizations, Russian organizations I mean, between the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers or the Forgotten Regiment, which is also a committee for defense of soldiers' rights, there's somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000 soldiers that they know of that are there, or that have been there. Also, there are plenty of arms that have been supplied by Russia. In other words, Mr. Poroshenko is obviously supposed to talk to locals, to
yes,
people who are there. However, given that this so-called rebellion has been foreign-led, obviously the first person he has to talk to is Mr. Putin.
Well, we're going to come back to that in just a moment and talk about the extent of Russian involvement in this. Also, what the next step is, since we haven't mentioned so far, with Washington having spoken recently of potentially arming Kiev with lethal aid. We're going to come back to that in just a moment in the second part of tonight's debate. Do stay with us.